What's one of the most important concepts of any network? Storage, particularly NAS or SAN storage. And that's exactly what we're talking about on today's episode of the Tech Informative. Welcome to the Tech Informative, everyone. This is a video podcast covering technology with a focus on corporate IT. I'm Stephen Wagner.
And I'm Rob Dalton.
You're watching our first main episode where we're going to be talking about storage, particularly NAS or SAN storage. So to get into it, Rob, let's just start covering the difference between a NAS or a SAN.
Yeah, so I think the primary difference is really the functionality or the purpose of what the storage device is actually being used for.
Mm-hmm. And when it comes to that, there's a few key differences between the NAS or the SAN. So I think the best way for us to just jump into this is just kind of cover what is a NAS, and then we'll jump over to SAN afterwards. My definition in the past, traditionally, years and years ago, a NAS was just a device that one could purchase that would provide typically file-based storage for a small network, whether it's a home network, business network, small office, home office, and it was just an easy device to use. That's in the conversation that we had prior about this. It was one of those things where you could just attach to a network.
Yeah, simplicity.
Mm-hmm. And that's what people want. They want cost-effective simplicity, and that's it. Now, over the years, these NAS devices have kind of transformed into devices that did so much more. Today, purchasing off the shelf, you can configure iSCSI NFS. They can act as web servers, security servers, virtualization servers, so you can even run VMs on some of these devices now. Another big hot topic too is surveillance footage recording. So companies that will purchase these devices set up 24 cameras and record. And I think you also had a couple other good points in the pre-stage there, continuing on.
Yeah, regarding the backups of a lot of the clients, agent or agentless, perhaps, depending on the NAS device. But they do hold various different features. I wonder what it is about, not to avoid digressing too much, but I wonder what it is about a NAS manufacturer or service that they continue to implement these other features like this. Almost like app-based, almost like your phone, and so maybe for that small to medium business or small business home user to try to get more, what do you suppose, more functionality or more services out of that box?
Yeah. Well, they're adding value to the actual devices. In large corporate networks, for example, you and I are familiar with using Veeam, which is a backup application that is used all over the world for backing up virtual environments. Whereas now a vendor like Synology, they have active backup for business, which can actually connect to a vSphere environment. It can connect to a vCenter server or standalone ESXi hosts. And it can perform virtual machine backups in a similar manner to Veeam, where it's performing de-duplication, compression, and for the small business or for the home lab at home, they keep on packing this value into it. And at the same time too, I think it puts a little bit of pressure on other vendors too to price their solutions a little bit more affordably, because why would you spend a fortune on some software when you can buy an off-the-shelf device to do this? There's other things that factor into that, but it's just kind of nice that they're kind of keeping each other in check with that. And like you said, with the apps, you can start storing photos on some of these NAS devices. You can open up a photo gallery on your phone and have access to it anywhere around the world. Same thing with directory services. You can configure a domain on some of these NAS devices now, as well as configure like an FTP server or an open VPN server so that you can connect your home network from wherever you go. Again, they're just packing more value into it.
Right. VPN endpoints, that sort of thing.
Yeah. So, and it's nice because it just, for the home user, for the small office, home office, or small business, if they don't have the budget, you can purchase something like this and get all that value packed into it.
Yeah.
But now moving on to a little bit more extensive list of requirements, now we start getting into the territory of actually using a SAN, which stands for Storage Attached Network. And again, this is another thing that you and I both have a lot of experience with. So when you hear the word SAN, what do you think of?
Well, I think of usually storage based off of a hypervisor connecting to the storage. So it's got its storage fabric to the storage. It's raw storage. It's not dabbling with these other ticketing systems and trying to perform these multiple roles that the storage. It's storage, and it's a highly efficient performance storage.
Yeah, and that's what the SANs provide. Is it's a dedicated network, and like you said, dedicated fabric. You could essentially think of it as a completely isolated network dedicated to storage for high availability storage. It comes with all the fancy stuff like redundant connections, depending on the protocols you're using. But with that being said, you have to have that dedicated fabric for it, and there's costs associated with that. But you get features like redundancy, the capabilities, and it's
Dedupe of the storage.
Yeah, and that's what's really nice about SANs is that they start incorporating technologies like that. So you start getting into dedupe compression, and even now there's like hyperconverged solutions, like for example HPE Simplivity, where they incorporate both the compute and storage fabric into a single solution, which is kind of cool. But we won't get into that too much. SANs typically found in enterprise environments, small and medium-sized business environments. If you're running a virtualized environment with multiple servers, you got to have a SAN if you want a reliable storage backend for the virtual environment. Same thing with, it doesn't matter if you're running VMware, Hyper-V, other solutions, SQL clusters, enterprise, Exchange, usually it's always backed by a SAN. So whether you actually have Exchange storing the mailbox files or mailbox database inside of a virtual machine, or actually just setting up a volume and presenting it to Exchange to store that, it's just storage, period, with the SANs. We already covered some of the technology that can come with it. Another good point that you mentioned before the video was encryption. Some of these vendors now are incorporating, what's the exact term, on encryption on the wire?
Well, it would be at rest more so than on the wire, right? But it's encryption at the storage level.
And it's nice because it's the vendors are incorporating technologies that really streamline this, so they don't actually cause any type of delay or
right. And there's requirements, right? Some manufacturers or companies are held by certain requirements of that encryption. So if they can do it at that manufacturer's level storage, they don't need another tool or something else on top of it to add the complexity of the storage, just to give that encryption piece.
Yeah. And, just taking the SANs a little bit further, another big thing that's happening lately, and this is like I think HPE and Nimble were the first to pioneer this type of technologies, is incorporating AI and machine learning into the picture of detecting failures, detecting firmware potential issues, disk issues, predictive failures. And that's not exclusively to AI, machine learning, and Nimble. Like there's numerous SANs will actually flag predictive failures, whereas that's something that like a NAS device wouldn't have. But there's a bunch of features and functionality there.
Yeah, I think that the NAS boxes probably extend themselves to only like the smart drive scanning or monitoring, or maybe some of them have some of the RAID analysis or something like that, but nothing really predictive like the SANs do.
But the SAN, if we're talking about NASs or SANs, we would think about a NAS as a device, whereas a SAN is more of a solution. It's a storage solution.
Yeah.
A NAS is something you buy at a store, you set up, use it for some type of storage, whereas SAN is something that you incorporate into a solution. By incorporating it, you're incorporating reliability, redundancy, support, cost of ownership, all that fun stuff. So there are two different kinds of things, and getting into that, if we start talking about choosing a NAS or a SAN, there's a whole bunch of different type of uses. we covered them going into each thing individually, but with me being an IT provider, I often see this. I see a lot of companies that don't know if they should purchase a NAS or a SAN, and there's a big price difference. And so it always comes down to a whole bunch of stuff where, I see companies that are purchasing a NAS when they should be purchasing a SAN,
Right.
or I see vice versa. And so I'm hoping that in this video and just getting into the things that we're going to be here, we can kind of just talk about the differences. And so just kind of kicking this off, there's the uses of a NAS or a SAN. With a NAS, you see file storage, you see some block storage, iSCSI, NFS, and then there's all these special applications. Whereas with a SAN, it's traditionally block, iSCSI, NFS, fiber channel, or some other technologies. Do you want to jump into reliability comparing a NAS or a SAN?
Well, yeah, and I think that reliability, we hit on a couple of them, but for me, I think that reliability of the device, support, and performance are key, and expandability as well. I don't know, what kind of expandability you can do on a NAS box as far as what you can compare to a SAN, but reliability, you've got your redundant power supplies, which some NAS boxes do have, right? But that's all hot swappable power supply, functionality. You've got your controllers. So the controller itself is essentially a compute board or some type of hot swappable box that you can replace. Have you seen virtually?
Sorry to interrupt, but virtually it's all modular.
It's all modular. Yeah. So not just the drives, but the device itself. Are you familiar with any NAS devices that have the controllers or power supplies that are swappable?
So I think when you start getting into some of the entry-level NAS devices, a lot of them don't have capabilities. The drives are typically hot swappable. If you start getting into a higher price point, I think you can get to the point where power supplies are hot swappable. But at the same time, too, you have this issue where a lot of these products, over time, they become unsupported. And so the thing is that if you end up having a NAS device, and even if your power supply is hot swappable, 5 years down the road, with a vendor that doesn't have support contracts, even though the power supply module is replaceable, what kind of guarantee do you have that you're actually going to be able to purchase that power supply module?
Right. So that really much goes back to the support, longevity.
And that's one of the big things is when you're comparing a NAS to a SAN, is do you want to have a product that is going to be supported extensively to the point where you can renew support contracts on it so that that there will always be hardware available to swap it, and you'll always have a support team that's ready to deal with these issues immediately. Whereas with a NAS device, if you purchase it, the company will provide support, but they're constantly issuing new generations. They're incorporating new features, which may actually decrease the reliability. And again, it goes back to long-term support, which it really could lack. Because, I guess you could purchase the next generation of their units, move the disks, but at the same time too, it becomes a hassle. Whereas in a business or a mission critical environment, you want to have things taken care of immediately. You want to know that it's a solution that you can implement for a long time and actually come up with a migration plan if you ever do have to migrate away from it. Whereas again, with the NAS, I wouldn't say it's part of a solution. It just takes care of a problem.
Yeah.
And just moving forward, the cost, that's what you're paying for. You're paying for a solution versus paying for a device. You're paying for performance with the SAN, whereas with the NAS, you're paying for an economically priced data storage solution. So you might not necessarily be getting that storage. And I could be wrong because not wrong, but they are introducing technology such as SSD caching. So, you can start cranking out those killer IOPS and you can start doing some of this stuff. But at the same time too, it always goes back to reliability. Do you want a reliable solution?
It does.
Right?
Some of those customers you mentioned before that were maybe implementing a NAS box in for their storage for the company. um, the compute board goes bad, or let's say the power supply goes bad, what do they expect as far as downtime? How long can they be down in the event of, okay, well, we need to purchase a different storage box because you can no longer get this board or this power supply, and then how are you moving the data over? So you've got to, so it just adds complexity in that environment that you mentioned for a client.
Yeah. And you're tinkering. There's no clear path moving forward. You're tinkering to get back
Right.
online. Whereas with the solution, with the SAN, there's a process to get back online. There's just steps that you must follow. And that's the big thing.
Right. And in comparison to something like, I know we wanted to touch on it, but I've had a nimble device, maybe a hard drive, go bad at 4:00 a.m. Eastern Standard, and before I was in the office, it was at the door. It was ready there. So that's just your comparison between these NAS boxes and a enterprise grade storage.
Yeah. And the thing is that with a NAS device, this is another problem too. So if you have a failed drive, you could keep stock of other drives that are similar, but what's going to happen is that, let's say that you have an array with 8 disks. So it fails, you don't have an extra drive on hand. You're going to have to wait for the local retailer to open up. And then you're going to try to actually purchase a similar drive that's identical. You may not be able to get that identical drive. I've had people reach out to me where they purchase, like 8 of the same Seagate drives, toss it in a Synology device, and then it fails. And the Seagate drives that they purchase are no longer available. So now they're starting to mix different drives that have different performance characteristics, different storage characteristics, and different rates of failure. And it complicates the mix.
Yeah.
And, it's not right in a business or a mission critical environment to have an array of disks where one disk is acting different than the others.
Yeah.
And I guess it's what you pay for. Because again, if you're storing grandma's photo collection on, a NAS device, that's fine. Because, you just want some decent speed storage, but you're not going to in any type of situation do that. If you've got, 10, 20, 30, 100 virtual machines, you want to have that on solid, reliable backed storage, right?
Yeah. 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 I think it really comes down to the use of it, of the storage.
Yeah. And speaking of uses, this is a big thing that you brought up in the planning for this video, was the security aspect. Especially with the NAS devices, with all these value features that they're adding in. What does that do for security?
Yeah, right. It just opens up a huge footprint of vulnerabilities and whatnot. A couple of years ago, maybe a year ago, QNAP had some issues with their security. And so I don't recall what it is, but you are bringing these tools, and we don't really know where these tools are, and you're bringing them in on your network, almost like an IoT device, right? So you don't know what it's actually doing code-wise. So it brings those other features, but
yeah, and people are exposing these NAS devices to the internet now. So, they set up an FTP server, they set up an open VPN server, they start doing application servers, virtualization servers. A lot of people are actually connecting this box or setting up a firewall to actually forward or NAT those ports to their internal networks.
Yeah,
so,
right.
Like I said before, grandma's photos, it's all good. I don't think that there's too much to worry about. You can just make some backups, but you would never, ever, ever do that in a business environment, because it would be directly putting your storage at risk. And that's a big deal, especially if you have any intellectual property or critical data. If someone were to gain access to it, if it was personnel files, that's kind of a big deal. But at the same time too, there's always the common ransomware attack. So what happens if you have all your business data on there, you don't have a backup solution, and they connect using a remote access application that you're running on it, and all of a sudden everything's encrypted on your NAS, right?
Yeah.
And that's a big thing, is that you're increasing the security footprint with the added services that you utilize on these devices. And again, this is part of the thing that we have to advise our audience to, is that you have to balance the uses, your requirements, as to which kind of solution you're going to buy. It doesn't matter if it's for your home network or a small business, remote office, branch office, or enterprise solution. There's a specific product for a specific purpose that you always need to apply, and that's what's kind of, you got to weigh out the risks. And we just covered the NAS, and so Rob, I don't know if you want to jump into the SAN networks and the differences between a NAS and a network that a NAS sits on versus a network versus a SAN.
Yeah, well, you're going to have to build that infrastructure, that storage fabric, to connect to the hypervisors or whatnot. I would think for the most part, right? If you don't have, if you're running virtual machine, if you're not running virtual machines and hypervisors, does a SAN benefit you? I would think that it would be very challenging to justify that.
I do know I've helped customers out that do actually have SANs for SQL clusters.
Okay.
And without using virtualization, they use them for Exchange, line of business applications. I know that companies or corporations that are utilizing SAP, they'll usually have it sitting on a SAN, even if it's not virtualized. So there are some uses, but again, these are all mission critical that we're talking about.
Right. And for the NAS boxes, they tend to use, like you said, off the shelf storage drives, where you're not going to be able to just go down or purchase something online and replace a SAN storage disk itself.
Mm-hmm. And and jumping into the SAN networks, it's like with the SANs, you have special drives with special firmware. They're designed for the SANs. And actually, just jumping back into the differences with the SAN networks, it's a separate fabric. It's fabric that's dedicated towards file storage itself. And so the thing is that you're limiting a lot of the security holes or security issues, just because the only traffic that's going across that network, whether it's an Exchange environment, it's Exchange storage. SQL, it's SQL storage. Even with virtual machines, it's just the storage of those virtual machines. And in an environment that's set up using leading practices, technically nothing should be able to touch that network except for the ESXi hosts or the Hyper-V hosts. And so, if a network gets compromised or something like that, it's still a separate network dedicated to storage. And as long as, like I mentioned before, leading practices are used, technically, even in a horrible security compromise, they shouldn't be able to touch that storage network. And with the some of the features that these SANs have with snapshots and whatnot, you can roll a snapshot back to pull things if the network gets hit with ransomware or something like that. I'm getting a little bit ahead, but I just wanted to cover the differences in the security issues of a NAS on a traditional computer network, whereas SANs have their own dedicated network, because that's what a SAN is. It's storage attached.
Yeah, and to our point with the fabric, dedicated interfaces on the hosts or the servers, going to dedicated switches that are configured for storage. And we have redundant switches in a stack or HA type of situation. And then from there back to the redundancy of the interfaces on the storage.
Yep. And it's dedicated traffic. So with those virtual machines, the virtual machines have direct access to the storage. It's not going over the same wire as, the network that they're using to provide services to client computers. And that's a big difference. Whereas like with the NAS, it doesn't have that.
Right. It fits. So the NAS fits in your existing environment.
Yeah. So with the SAN, you've got added performance, you got added reliability, and you've got added security, just because it's a separate, isolated network.
Right.
Yeah. And we were just also talked about the hardware there. We've covered in the past about earlier in the video regarding power supply redundancy. But another good point that you brought up earlier was the hot swappable controllers and components.
Right. So even let's think about even doing a firmware update. 2 controllers, updating firmware on controller A, for example, and it's running on B, the second controller. And once that firmware is uploaded and proven that it's functioning properly, it'll flip over and then do B. So there's zero downtime.
Yeah.
Whereas when you're
and it's cool.
when you're doing a firmware update on a NAS box, you will experience downtime.
Yeah. And I can vouch for that because, like, upstairs I've got an MSA, and that's one of the coolest features ever. I could be running, things can be operating, everything's running, and you kick off a firmware update even when there's IO being performed on the box. And like you said, it just does one controller, waits for it to come back online, everything syncs up, and then takes the other controller. And that's some of the functionality that you'll only see in a SAN. And there's technical reasons for this. It's not only because you have those different controllers, but for example, in a SAN, like whether you're using SAS disks or SSD disks, SANs are actually designed to use, both ports on an SAS disk. And that's one of the reasons why if one of the ports fails, you've got the redundancy there. You've got the redundancy on the backplane because it has both of the methods of the transport to the dual ports on the SAS disk. And it's the same thing with the controllers too. The controllers have different paths to access those disks. And that's what's really nice with the SAN, whereas you will not see that in probably 80% of NAS devices. There are some exceptions with some of the vendors that create NAS products where they create their own. I believe FreeNAS has a couple of devices that would actually more be categorized as a SAN because it's got the multiple controllers. And I believe it utilizes like the different ports that could be used on an SAS connection.
Sorry to interrupt. FreeNAS, is that the same as a TrueNAS?
Yes. So FreeNAS is I'm not too sure if I would say that's fully open source. It's based off of.
I think it is open source.
Yeah. So it's based off of FreeBSD, and just recently they changed the name from FreeNAS to TrueNAS.
Okay.
Yeah. But just jumping back in, so with those modules, it's great because if a backplane fails, you can replace it. Power supplies, you can replace it. Controllers, you can replace. Disks, you can replace. It's just very modular. Whereas with the NAS, it's typically usually just the disks themselves,
right,
that are modular.
Yeah.
Just moving on, I think should we cover a little bit of on the protocols that some of these NAS and SAN devices can offer?
Yeah, let's do that. One point that you had on the fabric we had discussed was the active passive technologies that's within each individual storage device or manufacturer. So some manufacturers are going to be like we used to use EqualLogix. And they were traditionally, the boxes that we were using were active passive. So that meant that everything was running actively on one controller, and the secondary controller is in passive mode, waiting to take over the role. And so it's all throughput, everything compute is running off of that initial controller. Whereas active would be, it's enhanced and functioning with both controllers at the same time. Mm-hmm. So you've got double the throughput for the most part for the storage array.
Yeah, and usually you would never see this with NAS devices. Right. This is just with SANs. And again, for some of the like active, you're looking at spending more on a SAN that can do active, whereas a SAN that's active passive is probably a little bit more cost effective. But again, you don't get the same capabilities or redundancy.
Yeah.
So,
and you kind of have to be really cautious with the active, because I have seen some manufacturers claim active to active, but then they were not running. It was more of an active passive mode. The secondary controller is active and hot and running, but it's waiting to take over the role if need be. It's not truly active.
Yeah. So I could see that being a big gotcha if you weren't expecting that.
Yeah, so that's something to pay attention to.
Yeah.
Sorry about that. Yeah, so the protocols.
Yeah, so with the protocols, so traditionally, again, with the NAS, traditionally being for file-based network storage, you'd probably typically see SMB, which is Windows shares. As time came on, they started providing, you could have a NAS act as an iSCSI target. You could also configure NFS, network file system, which is something commonly used for virtualization storage, also used in Linux and Unix environments. Whereas with SANs, traditionally with the SAN, and correct me if I'm wrong here, but you usually always see NFS, iSCSI, or fiber channel,
Mm-hmm.
right? And with NFS, iSCSI, and fiber channel, that's when you start getting some of the more advanced features like MPIO. Some of the NAS devices that do iSCSI can do MPIO and round robin, although they don't usually handle it in the same way or as reliably as a SAN does. And the same thing goes for NFS. I think it's a lot more likely to see NFS enhancements like PNFS, which is parallel NFS, similar to iSCSI MPIO, work more reliably in a SAN versus actually using something like that in a NAS, which I don't even think that there's a lot of vendors that don't fully support that yet, or there's reliability issues. I think I actually tried deploying PNFS on my Synology NAS once,
Okay.
and it worked great for the first couple minutes, and then it just kept on crashing
Hmm.
every 48 hours.
Hmm.
So I ended up having to do that and jump back to iSCSI.
I remember seeing a NAS box a couple of years ago, and they were touting how they could go iSCSI and start supporting the hypervisors. Really?
Yeah.
Something's not right here.
Yeah.
The little guy's
Well, and
trying to play in the big world.
yeah, well, you know, it's come a long way, and in some environments, it's semi-reliable. Today, I use Synology with iSCSI on my own network.
Okay.
It wasn't reliable enough for me to actually put important payloads on or mission critical workloads, but I still use it as a backup destination,
I think they're
and I'm
great
using
for that.
iSCSI. Yeah, so cold storage, you know, it's writing not consecutively, but what is it? Contiguously.
Okay.
It's writing contiguously. So it's perfect storage for that because you can max it out. You've got slower disks in there, and it's great. But
And it can go down, and you're okay with that. It can go down for a day if you weren't able to provide your backups for a day.
yeah, and they have to go down in order to keep them up to date. You have to take them
Mm-hmm.
down.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a perfect use application. Same thing with grandma's photos, right? You know, you can take the box down to update it. Talking about different types of protections, we can let's chat about RAID levels.
Okay.
So I think with a traditional SAN, you'll find traditional RAID levels. You know, whether it's like I typically only use 1, 5, 6, 10. I know that there's some others. I've never used RAID 3, but I think it goes similarly for NAS devices. They may be somewhat limited in the lower end devices, but I think typically you can find comparable RAID levels in the NAS devices. But at the same time, a lot of these vendors come out with their own customized RAID levels for these NAS devices. Like I think you mentioned in our prep for this video that you've seen it happen a couple times.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, so for like 3PAR, they do a very similar technology under the wire, I guess, under the table, as far as the way that they design or deploy their they call them chunklets, and they build CPGs based on these chunklets, and then you can build the RAID integrated with that CPG. So it's not just a raw RAID level like a NAS box, where it's taking and striping or whatever. Between those disks, there's a technology or a software AI that is sitting on top of the RAID levels, sitting on top of that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I can see that being valuable. But one thing that kind of upsets me, though, is like jumping to the NAS side. There's a lot of these NAS vendors that are kind of relabeling these non-standard RAID levels as their own and giving them their own name. If I was talking about this 6 months ago, I might actually be able to name one of them, but unfortunately I can't for this video. But it's just something that has to be considered because it could be risky playing with non-standard RAID levels. Like, you know, I like my RAID 5 when it's time to use RAID 5. I like using RAID 6 when it's time for 6. I like using 10 when it's time for 10.
Right,
and,
right.
You know, for the audience, a lot of the audience will know what we're talking about. For the audience viewers that don't know what we're talking about, Google the different RAID levels. And because they play a big factor into the protection and reliability of the storage systems for your drives. One other thing that I want to take the opportunity to mention too, while we're talking RAID levels, is for example with FreeNAS or with TrueNAS, it's built on I believe it's called the OpenZFS operating system, which was originally I don't know if it was a clustered operating system or a clustered file system, or if it was a file system that was developed with a specific purpose. But what's really one thing that's really neat about ZFS is that this is where some people get confused, is that ZFS isn't actually a RAID level. It's a file system that has built-in RAID capabilities. And so on a TrueNAS or a FreeNAS box or any type of system that's using ZFS, you can even load ZFS up on Linux, is that you create these disk pools and then you actually tell the ZFS, the file system, how to essentially RAID or put the data on those drives. And so you get the RAID redundancy, even though it's underneath the file system. Whereas in traditional RAID environments, you'd have the RAID on top, and then it would be the file system that sits under it. Whereas it's switched up a little bit with ZFS. And while we're on the topic of FreeNAS and TrueNAS, is with NAS or SAN devices, you can build your own, and that's kind of something that could be fun too, whether you're wanting to learn or if you have the hardware or the capabilities to do it. Years ago, I used to build my own NAS and SAN devices. You can load up a Linux box, set up Samba on it. You've got a Windows file share that you can dump data to. There's also, you can install your own iSCSI target. Back in the day, it was super difficult. You'd have to load up a special third-party iSCSI target. Thankfully, the Linux kernel, they incorporated Leo target into it, which supports all the fancy SCSI 3 reservations that are required for clustered access to an iSCSI target. But you can do that. You can set up an iSCSI target on a Linux box, and you can provide it direct access to block storage, or you can use a file system or a disk management solution to do some advanced virtual capabilities, and then ship those volumes out with the iSCSI target to a number of ESXi hosts. One last thing I just want to talk about here. Some of the TrueNAS capabilities, I would say that it might be safe to use in some business environments. FreeNAS and TrueNAS, they actually do have devices that you can purchase for them. There are a lot of businesses that are using them. It gets risky when you start creating your own. As far as building your own Linux, NAS or SAN, that would strictly be home lab, strictly for fun, strictly for photos. You would never want to do that with a business, just because you don't want to have to support it yourself.
And it goes back to the reliability that we had talked about before with the hardware, right? So hardware that you may have purchased 3 years ago, you may not be able to procure today.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And that's scary, because what happens if the motherboard goes in the Linux server?
Mm-hmm.
If you build your own TrueNAS or FreeNAS NAS, what's nice is that since you're using ZFS, they've designed it in a way that you can bring over disks to a new system. So if a system fails, you can bring it over and it'll recognize the Z pool, and you'll have access to a whole bunch of the components, which will make it easier. There's still some work because you have to build a new system. If you purchase a device from them, you'll have them to support it. So it'll be support similar to a SAN vendor, where they'll, they can ship out the controllers or the power supplies. You'll have a support team that you have access to. But if you're building your own solution with whether it's TrueNAS, FreeNAS, or with Linux, you're tinkering in the event of a failure.
Yeah,
and that can cause issues. So, and that's why it's always important to, no matter what solution you choose, whether it's a NAS or a SAN, is to have it backed by a decent vendor. Like for example, with HPE, they have a whole bunch of different solutions. Whether they've got some NAS solutions, they got some SAN solutions. Like Rob, you've dealt a lot with Nimble.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I'm a Nimble fanboy, I have to admit.
Yeah, and it's a nice solution. Like you get what you pay for. It is a beautiful, beautiful solution. Yeah. And I've done a lot with the HPE MSA product line. I think it's their lowest entry level SAN, and it's beautiful for small business or remote office, branch office. That little device, you can just throw it in and it'll just hum away for years and years and years. It detects predictive failures. It's reliable. It provides iSCSI, or you can do fiber channel. You can also have it connect to hosts via SAS. It's just solid. And as time has gone on, with the generation of the 2040s, they started incorporating SSD tiering, and now they got the 2050s, the 2052s. You got SSDs inside of there. It can do intelligent distribution of data, so the hot data goes onto the SSDs, and then you've got your warm data, cold data.
Some different tiering.
It's really matured, and like another. I think you've got some experience with HPE's 3-par line.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, we used to use the 3-pars quite a bit, and since started working with the Nimbles, probably 4 years ago, before HP purchased Nimble.
Mm-hmm. No. And another good one is the Simplivity. So talking about HPE Simplivity, that's when you start getting into hyperconverged infrastructure, where they incorporate compute with storage. But that's another solution that's really nice, and it's got the same type of enterprise support backing that any of the other HPE products have. And there's a couple other vendors too, right?
Yeah, EMC, NetApp. I have some experience with NetApp, Zero with EMC. Most of the products that I work with are HP focused, mostly around HP.
Yeah. And I think with both of us being HPE fanboys, just to be fair, Dell does have competing solutions. So, I think their competing product, Simplivity, is it VxRail?
I don't know.
And they've got some solutions that are similar to Nimble MSA, and that. And so that
we had the EqualLogics, worked with those for a while, the Dell EqualLogics. Really nice product. It was a fantastic experience, EqualLogic line. I do, this is just my personal opinion. It did seem like over the last 5-8 years that HP was playing catch up with Dell and EMC. But I think that's where they initially really. It seems like I remember a kind of a back and forth volleying of the purchase of 3-par. It seems like that was a Dell or HP. So HP ended up getting it, but I could definitely see, I think we hit this on a previous video, that where Nimble fits in fantastic for HP. It's a fantastic solution and a perfect fit, and has changed, in my opinion, the way HP and their storage works. It really enhanced the full line.
Yeah. And so it's a lot of these products and these vendors, whether it's HPE or whether it's Dell, EMC, NetApp, these are all SAN vendors that are going to back their products for mission critical.
Yeah, absolutely.
So they cost more, but the thing is that you're getting a reliable solution, a support team that'll stand behind them. And you won't have any of those issues. If you're running a solution 5 years later, 6 years later, if you're still paying for that support contract, that these vendors and these products will have your backs. Whereas that's not the same for NAS devices. And just to name a couple, like, for example, in my own environment, as far as using an NAS goes, I keep on mentioning the Synology device. And originally when I picked that up, I actually wanted to use it for my main storage for my business. And it was working for a little while, but there was this one day where one of these disks started acting up, and the Synology device wouldn't mark it as a failed disk, so it just froze. And I actually dealt with quite a bit of data corruption, and had to revert from backup. And this continued to happen a number of times where these disks would fail, and unfortunately the device just wouldn't actually mark it as fail. And that's one of the reasons why I ended up getting rid of, stopped using that for my main tier of storage, and migrated over to an HP MSA array for my business. And now I just use the Synology device as a backup media. And I think you had a similar situation with another product.
Yeah. So I purchased a Promise R. It's a VES series. A couple of them actually, and because it offered the reliability, or what looked like to be reliability, for the hot swappable power supply and the controllers. So the controllers can be pulled from the device. But to reflect back on what the difference is, it looks like a SAN. It says it's a SAN. It's really a NAS. that looks like a SAN. I don't want to say zero support, but close to zero support. Like we were trying to hit it with the hypervisors with VMware directly, and it just destroyed the all storage on the promise. It corrupted it. It corrupted itself based on the way that it was trying to do round robin and MPIO and that sort of thing. So again, it's much more economical than a full SAN, but fortunately we were using it as backups, as a backup target. And so we lost the backups. They still, to this day, have not resolved the issue, and they claim to be VMware 7, compliant. But it's still a NAS trying to fill the shoes of a SAN. But I don't. You probably would agree, but I wouldn't use any NAS device like that for anything other than a backup if it's based on my business.
Yeah, no, I agree 100%. Like for example, a lot of my video editing, I'll dump on the NAS for cold-based storage. But even when I'm doing video editing, I want the performance. So even though I paid a sweet penny for my SAN, I'm using it for video storage just so I can edit the videos fast. I just do not, for business purposes or for anything that requires, some sort of reliability, I just wouldn't feel comfortable storing it on a SAN. Even my own personal documents unrelated to the business, there's just stuff that I want to keep and know will always be there, and I'll back it up to the NAS. But as far as the storage that I want to be reliable, it has to sit on my SAN or some sort of or thing. But keep in mind, like we're lucky that we have these. Like we use them for business, and since I have my SAN for business, I can use it for some personal stuff too. But there's people out there that can't afford these SANs that are 20, 30, 50, 100 grand, and they'll need to purchase these devices, these NAS devices, because they can go pick it up and it's got 2 bays. They can toss 2 10 gig drives in it now, and just set up RAID 1. You've got it mirrored, so it's good enough, and that'll work just fine for them, right?
Yeah, and we're leaving one platform out that we should maybe digress into later, and that is into another episode. But cloud storage. Cloud storage is a new developing company, maybe a perfect solution.
Yeah, and that changes the picture of everything too.
It does.
Right. Yeah, because when you start incorporating that and start redoing your environments, you might want to have your base storage in the cloud, and you might want to have it back up to a local storage device, or you might want to have your main storage on-prem on a local device and then back up to the cloud. So there's a million different scenarios, and that's why it's a great idea to have a complete show dedicated to this.
Yeah, but even though cloud, it's still all about high availability. So how available do you want that data to be? Whether it's cloud, NAS, SAN, how available do you want that data to be to you and to your company?
Yeah. And it all comes with cost.
Yeah, it does.
Yeah. So, but again, it's all part of designing the solution. So the biggest thing, I hate seeing business owners or people in IT decisional roles going out, and I hate it seeing them purchase a SAN when they should, or they purchase a NAS when they should be purchasing a SAN. Storing data that has a price tag of $1 million plus, and they're spending $5,000 on a storage solution to protect that data, and they think it's going to be fine. When if you can have backups and you've got insurance, but the thing is that there's always the cost of downtime, and you've really got to buy the appropriate solution for the dollar value of the data, the reliability of the data, the access to the data, and that kind of stuff. So it's
how available do you want that data?
Yeah. So that's the biggest thing that it all comes down to. So I don't know, Rob, is there anything else we haven't talked about or covered in this episode?
Yeah, I think we covered quite a bit.
Yeah. So I think we can, would you agree that we can wrap it up there?
Yep, that's good.
Perfect. So coming up on the next episode, guys, we're still have that show planned for COVID-19 and the transformation that it caused with IT. As always, please leave feedback. Please leave comments. We're just starting out with these videos. We might skip some things that we should have talked about. We might not have gone into certain things in detail enough. So please leave a comment. If you have any questions, ask. If you want to leave a comment, we read and listen to everything. So please like and subscribe to the video and the channel. It really, really helps us out. So thanks for watching today, Rob. It's always a pleasure. It's always great to chat with you. So
good to see you.
Yeah. All right. Well, I hope everyone enjoys their day. Take care.
Stay safe.
Bye-bye.